David is just explaining to us that he has power because he has signs that tell us to start and stop. I'm just demonstrating the power. We speak up. To speak up now. Oh dear, and this is not going to go well. So the title of our talk is The Missing Perspective. I'm Chris. This is Mark. The talk talks around some of the work that we've been doing over the last few years. That's drawn from our kind of dissatisfaction with the way in which change is managed, the way change has been managed in the past. And we're going to sort of give you some ideas, some theories, and some examples of how we've used these ideas in our work. An honourable mention right at the start to Jabe Bloom, who we were just saying before we come in here, a lot of these ideas, we wouldn't have had these ideas wouldn't have come in, we wouldn't have been able to bring these to you if it wasn't for Jabe and the kind of the things he brought to us, taught us. So, there's kind of 3 stages to this talk. We're going to give you some key concepts, then we're going to tell you a short story, and then we're going to wrap it up with a bit of a theory of change. So, over to Mark.
Okay, so before I start with the key concepts, a little bit about something about perspective. So try to anticipate or explain the motivation of this guy. So who is he? What can you tell from what you see? Why is he running? Does that help you a little bit more to start to understand what he might be doing? Are you making some inferences, deductions? And when you see the third perspective, this suddenly all makes sense. So just a little thing. This is from an advert, a British advert in the 60s, and I forgot even what the advert was about. But does anybody recognize this? You haven't seen it this way, but if you look at what you're seeing, if you think you recognize what it is, speak up. This is a practice network. So everything you see is a practice. We're going to talk about practices. But if you don't recognize it, maybe this helps. I just rewrote it a little bit in form of practices. Does anybody recognize this? Surely. Somebody. Okay, so this is extreme programming. So if you, like me, were one of the people early in the game, try to start doing Agile early. So I started with extreme programming. That existed even before there was an Agile manifesto. But when I look back at it and looked at how they articulated, so this was a diagram. So you would click on the iteration, then it would take you to the iteration diagram. You could click development. So it's all nested. But it's all just a big practice network. And it's very interesting from a practice perspective. All the practices in XP existed already before there was XP. They were just distributed in various other frameworks. There was like Crystal and stuff like that. Lots of practices, lots of frameworks. But what was new in XP is how they were integrated with one another, how you would connect practices, when would you do which practice, in which context, etc. And if you go look at so you can still go to the Extreme Programming website, it's still up, you can still look at it, you will see that they talked even about why are you doing certain things, what does good look like, when would you stop doing a practice, etc. And you maybe remember the feedback loop diagram, they talked also about different time spans, different lengths of feedback loops. So I'm just going to take you now a bit deeper into the concepts, and let's start with what we mean with a practice. So I'm going to talk about we are going to talk about social practices. So a social practice, Reckwitz uses this definition, is basically routinized behavior, so something that you do again and again and again, in which you connect certain elements, you integrate, and so they become interconnected with one another. Or very everyday articulations from Elizabeth Shove, it's things that you do, that we're doing, and that are shared across time and space, and very important. The practices have an existence even when they're not performed. So, for example, most of you will have showered or bathed or washed yourself this morning, yeah? And the showering and the bathing, so our concept, these are practices that exist in our culture, even at moments when nobody would be doing them. Yeah? So Nobody usually does a shower at lunch unless it's a very hot day or so, but still, showering as a concept is something that's very embedded in our culture. It's about cleanliness and freshness and being presentable, etc. So we operate on, so there are many theories of practice. Not all practice theories explain practices exactly in the same way, so we have taken a liking to Elizabeth Shove's because she allows us, with her articulation, to do specific forms of analysis of practices by describing elements. And there's 3 elements. There's meaning, material, and competence. We currently see here material as technical. Why is that? I'll come to that in a second. But so the important thing when we think about practices is that elements of practices themselves can participate in many practices. Think of a database, yeah? So a database, you will have people who populate the database, you have people who query the database, you have administrators who maintain the database. So the database as a material participates in many practices. Practices can vary. I might write the query slightly different than another developer. It's still query writing. They can evolve. We can learn about optimizing queries and stuff like that. And they can shape other practices. Well, if we go away from relational databases, suddenly we can do different kind of development structures, etc., different architectures. They integrate into networks of activity. So there's never a standalone practice. Practices connect to other practices. And if you want to look at it in a certain way, what you can say is the social world is reproduced through practices. Let that sink in for a second. As I said, same elements can be part of multiple practices. And so what we arrived at once we started thinking about practices is looking at work the way it happens as a network of practices and start to think about change of practices. So an important thing to understand in this context, we often talk about socio-technical systems, and what I often see or hear other people see is like they treat the social and the technical as independent and then maybe overlapping. But really technical or technology is an aspect of social systems. And an easy way to understand that is what happens if nobody looks after the technology anymore? Yeah, so we just leave it be. It will decay, it will stop working, it will break. Technology only exists as long as there are humans that are carrying out practices that maintains, nurtures it, etc., keeps it going. So social systems are mediated by technology. So that's what we mean by a socio-technical system. So all we're going to talk about are socio-technical systems. These are social systems in which technology plays a role, but it's part of the social, not an independent part. Other concept, adjacent possible. This is from Stuart Kaufman. And I looked at his TED Talk for some inspiration how to explain it and just don't. Yeah, this really is one of the worst TED Talks I've watched. If I wouldn't understand the concept, I still was confused. I was actually even at some point, do I understand the concept? Because what he's talking about is really hard to understand. But in principle, what the adjacent possible means that you should look, when you look for a step, so you watch maybe Carl's talk this morning and he talked about iterating, etc., and slowly and going. That's the adjacent possible. Look what's possible now from what do you have, what exists in your current situation, how can you maybe recombine some of these things or introduce small things and just one step further and then check again. So it's integration of, if we talk about practices, of new practices. They're not invented, they're just new to your context. Somebody has experienced the practice elsewhere and says, oh, when I was in this other place, we used to do this, maybe this would help here. Or you just take elements of practices and combine them differently that already exist in the space. The important thing about the adjacent possible is that we can't think that far ahead. So if you've ever been part of long planning cycles, what you will have experienced is nothing ever happens the way we expected. Yeah, our ability to plan ahead is really crap. So then the important thing is that you constantly look at, okay, where are we now, and what's the smallest step we could, or a smallish step that we could take to make it better, and not trying something big. So since Carl already talked about it, I'm going to almost skip this. Gap thinking. This is this idea that we can think far ahead and then sort of imagine what the gap is like. So when I talk about this, I say, so this plan, how it's going to be in the future, that's a fantasy. And then we're limited in our understanding of the present because we're biased by the frustration. Oh, this isn't great and this is crap and blah, blah, blah. And wouldn't it all be nice if we had something completely different? And then we try to imagine how we bridge this gap. That's wishful thinking. Never happens the way. But the important thing is also if you are in a situation where there is gap thinking, people will put their political capital behind that ideal future vision. Yeah, and so it makes it very unsafe, previous talk, to talk about it's bad, it doesn't work, this is wrong. You can't say that because you have to go against somebody with a lot of political power in your organization. All the negatives. So what you want is to get to present thinking. So Carl explained this pretty well, so I'm going to skip this now. Other than you're trying, as I said before, you're trying from your current condition to understand what would be good right now. What does good look like right now? And then you just try to iterate towards that. And as soon as you've done that step, everything will look slightly different and you reevaluate what would be better. I think that's the last concept that I need to explain. I'm already long with it. Time span of discretion is a very important thing. So the easiest way to understand this concept is that at different layers of management, there are different time spans that people are thinking about. Yeah, so your exec board, they should think about 3 to 5 year time spans, and at the bottom of your management hierarchy, you have your development team, and if they do agile, they think about 1 to maybe 4 week time spans. But you need all these intermediate layers. So Elliot Jacks talks about the stratification of management layers. But an easy way to understand it, I'm using a diagram. This is from Stuart Brand's pace layering. And essentially, you can see at the top is fashion. It moves very fast. It changes every season. Then you have commerce. Well, that's a bit slower. It needs a bit more time. Infrastructure, even more slowly. It takes even more time to change. So the further down you go, governance, culture, nature. Okay, I think he was wrong about nature. He doesn't understand biology because nature moves really fast. It's just so vast that it takes us a long time to notice the change. But in principle, these are all different layers of pace, yeah? And so it's important in organization to be aware. You might experience this when an exec comes and sits in a planning meeting of a software team and they talk about 2 week or 4 week goals, and he can't or she can't see how that connects to the 2, 3, 4 year vision. That's because if you are embedded in practices of long time spans, and then you go to people who are embedded in practices of short time spans, you literally don't understand how they think. Yeah, you don't know these practices; they're not natural to you, and so this is, if you ever experience this, is if with the exec comes to the planning meeting of a team, they can't talk to each other, and the exec will go away and think like, oh, they don't do anything to further my goals. And the people who think about 2 weeks or 4 week time span will think, well, everything we do seems to be useless, so why are we bothering? The important thing, people act on different pace layers and they care about different things. And now I'm handing over to Chris to tell you a story.
Fantastic. So, the story I'm going to tell you is an excerpt of a story. It's an excerpt of a chapter. It's a really small part of a story where we kind of sort of look at investment in leadership and strategy and governance, and it's all mixed up and muddled up. But it will show the introduction of new practices, the change of practices. It will show hopefully show the adjacent possibles that allow these new practices to emerge into an environment, and there will be some stuff about time spans too. So the story takes place in Scotland, hence accent, with an organisation called Registers of Scotland, who are a government organisation in Scotland who hold the land registers and large asset registers of Scotland. The scene, well, the long arc of this story is set over 3 eras. I'm using the Taylor Swift definition of era here. We start with the supplier era. The supplier era was when Registers of Scotland had others. They had suppliers who developed the software for them, and they developed lots of software over multiple years, and then they gave it to them, and Registers said, that doesn't meet our needs, this isn't working for us. So in 2012, Registers of Scotland ended a large supplier agreement that they had for the development of the software. They found themselves in front of audit committees, etc., for doing so. And then the Agile journey began in Registers as they brought in the software development in-house. First couple of teams were going to develop some new systems to help solve some problems they had. They recognised that they needed to do more, so the transformation era began. This began in 2014 when they started to introduce many, many more teams. I think we got us to sort of around about 20 software teams or whatever, who were developing lots more change and lots more products. But what they were kind of working in an environment where we had agile ways of working. There was some teams doing Scrum stuff and other teams were doing XP and Flow stuff. But they were constrained within a project model, a project and program model. By 2017, we realised that while we had lots of great capabilities, we weren't getting the value, the organisation wasn't getting the value that it hoped to get from this transformation. So the transformation era came to an abrupt end with the closure of the transformation programme, and then the product era began. And that began around 2018, and there's some concepts there. So the story I'm going to tell you, it surrounds 2018, maybe into the early 2020, where this new product era kind of established. So first we have, our landscape here has 2 time spans on it. So after our transformation era ended, there was a gap between 2 time spans. The first time span at the top here is an executive time span, and what they care about, what they were doing was writing 5-year corporate plans. They cared about transforming the services. They probably had a better vision than the one I've captured there, but that's the size of things they cared about. They also had a risk register, and on this risk register was the IT estate. They had real concerns over the state of the IT estate. Then we had the next time span down from them was the delivery team time span. And these delivery teams, they were working in sprints, thinking about what they're going to do over the next 2-3 weeks, and so on. And there was a gap. The gap used to be filled by a transformation where all the governance took place, but that was gone. So an executive team went straight down to the delivery team level and started asking the delivery teams to write investment cases for 6-week pieces of work. That's the longest they could squeeze it out to, 6 weeks. But what we found was the delivery teams are going, why do I need to do this? What difference does this make to me and my work and what we're trying to achieve? And the executive would say, that isn't delivering our goals. Stop doing that and start doing something else. So we get into this phase of what I described as the start stopping and stop finishing phase, where no work actually emerged and was delivered value. So what we recognised, so the current condition here is we have a void that our transformation had left. We had the capabilities in our delivery teams. We had an executive with the compelling need and the desire for change. We had this void in how these teams would be organised and managed. The adjacent possible that existed at this time was a set of senior leaders who sat below the executive, who had all grown up in the organisation through these other eras, had experienced agile ways of working, understood the need for change, and sat in a layer below the executive, but they didn't work together. Right? They were separate groups. The organisation, through its transformation, had its theory of change was we need to work on people, process, and technology. It separated those out. So we found that there was actually tensions emerged between the people directorate, the operational directorate, and the technology teams. So we brought this team together, and we created a team of people who worked in this space to try and lead a change in the organisation. The new challenge was, at the top right there, the organisation. The new meaning that existed now from the executive was, well, you need to build trust with us. We need to trust that you're going to do the right things. So the executive needed trust from this team. The team then said, we have a problem here, which is the main problem that we really hung on to at the start was the risk in the IT estate. So we needed to introduce a new practice that helped us understand the risk in the IT estate. So we created a practice around a thing called product sustainability. And this was a visualization of the estate across the IT estate across the whole organisation and its fit for purpose. So the meaning that exists there was this reduction of the risk in the IT estate, the need to communicate to our executive what that state was, the competencies that existed in the creation of this heat map, were architecture, agile engineering, understanding what good product looked like, etc. And the materials that existed there were obviously the tools for creating some visualization, but also the data that helped us understand what that state looked like. From this practice, we created a product sustainability heat map, which then in future, if I move on quickly, future examples of this practice actually reinforced the practice. They became part of that network. But that wasn't enough with product sustainability. We also had to introduce some way of creating investment cases. Our executives said, we're not going to sign off X million pounds worth of investment because you've drawn a nice picture that shows the state of the IT estate. We needed another practice around investment cases. And then they started to understand what it was. We'd created something that spoke at a time span that they understood, that they cared about. We also recognised that this team that we introduced was still too far away from the delivery teams. So we introduced another layer into the organisation, and this was a layer of senior product managers and a team that worked with those senior product managers. They brought in practices and understanding around IT architecture, and we introduced agile coaches into this space to help them develop their ways of working. Crucially, we also had this role called domain coordinator, and that was the ex-project managers. We recognised the value in the practices the project managers brought, and we brought them together into this team. Now, we needed other practices to make this governance work. So we recognised then the need to be able to communicate on a regular basis the status of the change that we were making. So we introduced a weather report. We asked the product leadership to write a weather report, and this weather report basically said, this is what's just happened, and this is our forecast as to what's about to happen, and it's covered about a month either side of that time. The reason why we asked the senior product leadership to develop this, because they were closer to the context, they understood it better than the change leadership team did. But what they didn't understand was how to write it in a way that the executive understood. So in essence, what would happen is the product leaders would write this report, the change leadership team would take this, knowing what it meant above to the executive, and would rewrite it in a way that the executive would understand, while still keeping the core intent of what was written there and the core message of what was written there. Other practices emerged, I won't go through all of these, that started to stabilise this system of work, how we were going to govern this change, develop strategy for this change, articulate the benefits, ensure we had the investment on a regular basis. All of these practices all knitted together. And what threaded through this network of practices was, this is a government organisation, and it will be audited at some point to say what decisions it made over time. In 2019, auditors came knocking on the door, and we produced all of the artefacts that we had created through the year and a half of doing this. And it turns out that our IT architect was invited to speak at an audit conference because they quite liked what we had done. Other practices emerged. This is just, as I said, this is an excerpt of a story, but the really interesting thing that started to happen was, as the practices matured, the need for some of them disappeared. The competence in the product management, they started to understand how to articulate in a way that the executive needed to hear things, and needed to understand things. So those practices that we were into, the change leadership team had inserted, were no longer needed. But what happened was that the outcome of this network stayed the same, but the practices inside it evolved and changed. At one point, we had built that level of trust, so to the point where executive decided to remove another practice from this network. They no longer wanted the change leadership team to take part of this in the monthly review. They no longer needed them to be coming and telling the story on a monthly basis. They trusted that this team would lead the change and lead the change that they wanted to see. So hopefully you can see here there's a series of current conditions. Right? We'd said this is our needs. We had developed a practice which had created new needs. And to satisfy those new needs, we looked at the adjacent possibles around. We looked at the meanings that were there, we looked at the competencies were there, looked at the materials and artifacts that existed, and we developed new practices that fit within that context. Yeah? And those practices, again, generated new needs. This overall, a network generated new needs, which created new practices. And as those practices changed, those other practices kind of started to remove themselves or be removed from the network. So, Given it's a story, they all lived happily ever after. You didn't. There are other aspects of this story that I can maybe tell if anyone wants to ask afterwards, that were more challenging but in a different space. So what we see here is meaning emerged from the needs. So the meaning for our practices emerged from the needs. We developed practice that worked in context. You probably didn't recognise any of those practices up there from any of the books that we talk about at conferences like this. The outcome of the network stabilised while the practices still evolved. And the materials, I talked about the artefacts that some of the practices created that were established, they reinforced the practice and kept those practices stable within that network. Mark.
Okay, so to wrap up, just a little bit about theories of change. So you will know a lot of theories of change, whether you know them as theory of change or not. The most common one is people resist change. So in my experience, this is wrong. People change all the time. Think about yourself. You probably have changed habits that you had from 10 years ago, 15 years ago. You're not wearing the same fashion. We change all the time. What people resist is change that is imposed on them. When other people come to you and they say, you have to change and in this particular way, this is when you will resist because they don't know you. They don't know your circumstance. They don't know your practices. Yeah. So the practice lens, what we found is it enables to have these conversations with the people who we want to change in a participatory way. Yeah, we're not going to say already up front, hey, here's the change that we want to see. We say we would like a direction, a true north. But now we're going to look at the practices that you do, and with you go and talk on how should these practices change. So, for example, if you want to have a digital transformation, well, go and look at the practices that will be impacted by the change of material. Yeah, that's what you do in a digital transformation. You change the material. You go from some normal things to, thank you, some digital things. So people are perfectly okay with change, but they want to be part of the change. The second, very popular in lean environments, I believe, is act yourself into new thinking. That's an okay way of change if you have somebody who can model the way in which you need to act. So you have a mentor, you have a teacher. They've done it already. They know what good looks like. They can adjust if you make mistakes. They can correct, etc. But it's not a suitable model if you have to discover the new state that you're looking for. If there's no template to follow. Almost the most popular change theory is what Elizabeth Shove has monicked as ABC. So attitude, behavior, change. So the narrative goes, in order to change, to see change happening, people have to change behavior. And in order for them to change their behavior, we have to change their attitude. And what that actually means is, okay, we're targeting your attitude. Your attitude is wrong. So I'm just guilted you. I shamed you. I blamed you for being the blocker to the change. And how motivated will you now be to engage positively in the change that I want you to do? Not. Shove has a whole, so there's a paper that she wrote where she looked at about 20 or 30 approaches that the government has taken to change, like energy change, etc. Anything that's driven by the ABC model didn't work, yeah? Whereas anything that actually targets how are we doing certain things and how do we need to change the practices of doing certain things, how that helps. And the last one is people, process, technology, and that's Chris already described in his story. The problem with that is that you're trying to describe a whole in which people, processes, and technology exist, but they need to, but they need to come together. So dividing them into three categories actually is a reduction and it prevents you from seeing the whole. Yeah, you need to have it together. So practice theory of change is more integrative. It is more participatory. So if you use practice or what people are doing, don't worry about the scientific thing. It's an activity. It's what people are doing as your unit of analysis and go from there. How do we need to change what people are doing? You don't need to worry about their inner lives, what their attitude is. Just as an example, XP has been successfully implemented in teams with very different neurological or psychological profiles. It doesn't matter who you are, yeah? It's a team thing. It's a social level. The individual can be the way they are. We don't need to inspect it. We don't need to ask them to change as individuals. I think we explained all the rest. So then behavior change becomes an outcome. Yeah, you will see that the behavior changes, but you're not targeting the behavior. You're using it maybe as a metric. So are the behaviors changing? Yes. If you act on practices, you will see that happening. And the last one, just because you're...
Thank you.